Report 1. I have always enjoyed exploring abandoned places. There is something unsettling, yet fascinating about walking through spaces that were once full of life, now left behind. However, after one night when I entered an abandoned airplane, I could never think of it the same way again. The airplane was not in the middle of a remote field, in an area known only for being isolated. I had heard about it on an urban explorers forum. No one knew how it ended up there, but there were rumors that it was cursed. I should have taken the warnings seriously. I convinced my friend Chris to come with me. He was skeptical about these things, but agreed because he wanted to take pictures for Instagram. We drove for hours until we reached the site. It was an open field surrounded by dense forest. In the middle, like a forgotten statue, was the airplane. The fuselage was covered in rust with signs of wear and vegetation growing around the wings. The windows were dirty and opaque, and the main door hung at an angle as if it had been torn off. Even from a distance, I had to feel that something was wrong. Chris took some pictures while I examined the entrance. The smell was strong and disturbing, like something old and rotten. When we finally entered, darkness enveloped us. We turned on our flashlights and saw the corridor that led to the cockpit. The rows of seats were still intact, but covered in dust and mold. We walked carefully down the aisle. The silence was overwhelming, except for the occasional sound of something falling from somewhere. Some of the seats still had forgotten items, open suitcases, moldy blankets, and even a pair of children's shoes, too small for anyone to have left behind willingly. Chris was focused on taking pictures while I looked around. That's when I noticed something strange. Some of the chairs had scratch marks on the armrests, as if someone had gripped them tightly. "This is crazy," Chris said, laughing, as he took a picture of one of the shoes on the floor. But as he laughed, I heard a sound, low, almost imperceptible, like a suggestion coming from the back of the plane. "Did you hear that?" I wanted to know. Chris looked at me, confused. "What did you hear?" I tried to ignore it, but the feeling that we were not alone began to grow. We continued exploring until we reached the back of the airplane where the restrooms were. The door of one of them was slightly ajar, and Chris, ever curious, decided to take a look. When he fully opened the door, he stepped back immediately. "There's something in here," he said, his voice trembling. I shined my flashlight inside and saw what he meant. There were handprints on the bathroom mirror, but they were not normal. They were small, like a child's, and they were fresh. Before we could process it, we heard footsteps, slow, coming from the front of the airplane, as if someone were walking toward us. We turned off our flashlights and fell silent. The sound stopped, but the silence now felt even more oppressive. When I turned my flashlight back on, I saw something that made me freeze. A shadow quickly passed between the rows of seats. It was not my imagination. Chris saw it too. "This isn't funny," he whispered, trying to sound calm. We tried to head back to the entrance, but it felt like the corridor had grown longer. The peaceful rows of seats stretched infinitely, and the exit door was no longer visible. That's when we saw it. At the end of the corridor, near the cockpit, there was something standing, a tall figure, motionless, facing directly toward us. My flashlight began to flicker, and when the light returned to normal, the figure was closer. It was not a person. Its movements were erratic, as if each step was taken with effort. Chris let go of my arm, and we began to run toward the exit. But the corridor seemed to transform. The rows of seats tilted and the floor felt more menacing, as if we were walking on something alive. The sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, as if the thing was running now. Finally, we saw the light of the exit and threw ourselves out of the airplane. We ran across the field until we reached the car, breathless and covered in sweat. When I looked back, I saw the figure standing at the door of the airplane, just watching us. Its eyes glowed in a way that seemed impossible. We drove non-stop until we got home. Chris didn't say a word during the drive, Since that night, we have avoided talking about what happened. A few weeks later, I received a message from Chris. He had reviewed the photos he took in the airplane. In one of them, deep in the corridor, you could see the figure. But it wasn't a person. It was something much more wrong. Chris deleted the photos, but sometimes I feel like it is still watching us. And I am sure that if we go back to that airplane, we won't come out again. Report 2. I have never been the type to believe in ghost stories or supernatural phenomena. But a few years ago, during a trip through the Arizona desert, I encountered something that made me question everything. An abandoned airplane, alone in the middle of an empty field, seemed to be waiting for someone or something. That afternoon, I decided to explore. I was alone, in scorching heat, with no clouds in the sky. I didn't know that by entering that airplane, I would leave behind the sense of security I had always felt in solitude. I was driving down a back road when I saw the airplane in the distance. It was an old model, possibly from World War II, with the fuselage partially buried in the sand and paint worn by time. It seemed completely out of place, surrounded only by the emptiness of the desert. I stopped the car on the shoulder and began walking toward the site. The closer I got, the more I noticed the absolute silence. There was no sound of wind, no birds, not even the buzz of insects. Just my footsteps echoing in the sand. I reached the airplane, and the first thing I noticed was the state of the windows. They were all dirty from the inside, with marks that looked like fingers scratching the glass. The main door was partially open, swaying slightly as if someone had just entered. I took a deep breath, turned on my flashlight, and stepped inside. Inside, the air was colder than I expected, with a metallic smell mixed with something that resembled mold. The aisle was narrow, with rows of seats on both sides. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was something strange. The floor was clean, as if someone had recently passed through. The seats were still lined up and had a few objects left behind: a small suitcase, a worn hat, and even an open book on one of the armchairs. I leafed through the book and saw that all the pages were blank except for the last one, where someone had scribbled, "Get out now." My heart began to race, but I continued exploring. With every creak of the floor, the light from my flashlight seemed dimmer than usual. At the back of the airplane, I found what looked like a cargo area. Wooden crates were stacked up, some open, revealing rusty instruments and airplane parts. But what really caught my attention was a sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to come from inside one of the crates. A sound of something scraping, as if someone was scratching wood from the inside. As I approached the crate, I felt the air around me grow heavier, as if something invisible was pressing against me. I hesitated to touch the lid, but the sound stopped immediately. Before I could decide whether to open it or not, I heard a crack from the aisle behind me. I quickly turned my flashlight, but there was no one there. Still, the silence felt different now, denser. I walked back down the aisle, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me. It was then that I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints in the dust. They weren't mine. They were small, almost childlike, and were heading toward the cockpit. With my heart racing, I followed the footprints. I reached the cockpit and saw that the door was partially closed. I slowly pushed it open, and the sound of its hinges echoed through the airplane. Inside, everything was as it should be: old instruments, rusty levers, and chairs covered in dust. But on the pilot's seat, there was something disturbing. An oxygen mask hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly, as if it had just been released. As I stared at the mask, I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, coming from the aisle. I instinctively turned off my flashlight, freezing in the dark. The sound grew closer, accompanied by something else. A breath. It was irregular, as if something was struggling to breathe, but it sounded too human to be an animal. Carefully, I turned the flashlight back on and pointed it toward the aisle. In the distance, something moved. A shadow darted quickly between the seats, so fast that I almost doubted what I saw. I tried to control my panic and walked slowly toward the exit. When I was just a few steps from the door, I felt a pressure on my shoulder, as if something had touched me. I looked back, but there was no one there. That's when I realized the windows, which had been opaque and dirty, were now completely clean, revealing the desert outside. But the reflection in the window showed me something that hadn't been there before. A figure was sitting in one of the seats, staring directly at me. I ran out of the airplane, not looking back. When I finally reached my car, my whole body was trembling. I started the engine and drove non-stop until I reached the hotel where I was staying. I spent the entire night trying to understand what had happened. The next morning, I decided to look for information about the airplane. I found out that it was part of a military mission that disappeared without explanation in the 1950s. I don't know what I encountered in that airplane. I don't know if it was something real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But to this day, I avoid isolated places. Some places aren't abandoned by chance, and some things should remain forgotten. Report 3. It all started when a friend of mine, Caleb, told me about an abandoned warplane he found while hiking. He said it looked untouched, hidden in a clearing in the middle of a dense forest. Caleb knew I loved exploring things like that and insisted that I go with him. It's a rare find, he said, probably from World War II. I couldn't resist the curiosity, but looking back, I wish I had never gone. We left early in the morning and drove to the entrance of a little-known trail. Caleb explained that he had stumbled upon the plane by accident weeks earlier, but hadn't had the courage to go in alone. The trail was long, surrounded by dense trees that blocked almost all sunlight. After about 2 hours, the clearing finally appeared. In the middle of it, the plane was resting as if it had fallen from the sky and simply stopped there. The fuselage was enormous, weathered by time, with holes showing bullet marks and faded military paint. The silence around us was unsettling. There were no birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dry grass. "So, what do you think?" Caleb said, smiling nervously. "Intimidating," I replied while examining the structure. The cargo door was open, revealing the dark interior. Caleb went in first, and I followed closely behind. Inside, the smell was strong, like rusty metal mixed with something reminiscent of rotten meat. The floor was covered with debris, broken pieces, and yellowed papers that looked like operation manuals. The pilot seats were intact, but the cockpit windows were opaque, blocking any light from outside. In the aisle, there were military seats lined up, with seatbelts still fastened, as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. While Caleb was taking pictures, I found something that made me uncomfortable. Military helmets scattered across the floor, with marks that seemed deeply dramatic. "Do you think anyone survived this?" I asked, pointing to the helmets. "Who knows? It might just be time that did this," Caleb replied, although his expression showed that he didn't believe his own words. It was then that we heard it. A low sound, almost like a moan, coming from the back of the plane. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping immediately. Caleb nodded but tried to hide his fear. "Probably the wind," he said, laughing nervously. "Or something continuous, slow, steady, like something dragging across the floor." I shone my flashlight down the aisle, but I saw nothing but the seats. "Let's check it out," Caleb suggested, trying to sound brave. We moved toward the sound, each step echoing in the empty plane. We reached the cargo compartment, where the sound was louder. It seemed to come from one of the metal boxes in the corner. Caleb placed his hand on the lid and opened it slowly. Inside, there was something unexpected. Bones. Not animal bones, but clearly human. They were arranged in a pattern, as if someone had deliberately left them there. This isn't normal, Caleb said, backing away. Before we could process what we saw, we heard it again, but now it was coming from behind us. We turned quickly, but the aisle was empty. Caleb's flashlight began to flicker, and he started to panic. "This isn't right, let's get out of here." I agreed, but when we turned to the exit door, we saw something that made us freeze. A shadow was at the end of the aisle. It was tall and thin, with something that looked like a military helmet, but its posture was wrong, hunched as if it couldn't stand fully upright. "Who's there?" Caleb called out, but the figure didn't respond. Suddenly, it began to walk toward us. Its steps were awkward, dragging, and the sound echoed oppressively. We ran down the aisle, trying to reach the cargo door, but it felt like the aisle was getting longer. When we finally reached the exit, something grabbed my arm. I looked back and saw another shadow, now very close, with a cold, strong hand gripping my wrist. Caleb yanked me hard, and we both fell out of the plane. We ran through the clearing into the forest, not looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Caleb turned to me. "Did you see that? That wasn't human." I didn't respond. I couldn't find the words to describe what we had seen. We returned to the car and left as quickly as possible. A few weeks later, Caleb tried to go back to take more pictures, but the plane had vanished. The spot where it had been was now just an empty field. To this day, I avoid thinking about what happened. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear that same dragging sound, as if something is still following me. Some places are meant to be forgotten,